Hello, and welcome back to Unit 5, Industrialization and the City. And we are going to continue learning about the story of how the United States has changed over time and how industrialization played a role in us changing. So, up until now, we've been learning about the Industrial Revolution and how it changed the United States. We learned that factories and the assembly line created more jobs for people in the cities, and one major effect of this employment boom was urbanization. So these graphs show us the number of people who lived in certain areas of the United States, or populations of these areas. Graph A over here shows us the number of people who lived in urban versus rural areas during this time period. But what does rural and urban mean? Well, rural areas are like farmlands and places that are not cities. They typically do not have that big of a population, and most of the land there is for agriculture. Urban areas are where lots of people live and work together. These are big cities, major cities. So I want you to think about, what do you notice about these graphs and this time period? I want you to pause the video now and take a moment to examine these graphs. While you do that, take notes and document which graph you are talking about, A or B. This will hopefully get you in the mindset of citing your sources, and it will come in handy when we write our claim today. So go ahead and pause the video. So you should have noticed that the population in urban areas is growing way more than in rural areas. If you see in 1860, our rural areas, or the farmland areas, had about 25 million people, over 25 million people living in the rural areas, and only about 6 million in the urban areas. If you fast forward all the way to 1920, we've got 51 million in rural areas, but 54 million in urban areas. So while the population doubled in our rural areas and our urban areas, it much more than doubled. About 8 times what it was in 1860. And if you look over here at graph B, it supports the data that we found on graph A. In Chicago, the number of people went from 109,000 in 1860 to 1.5 million by 1900. So that population in the urban areas is going way up. So we are going to read this little expert to help us come up with our own definition for this word, urbanization. Urbanization. One of the defining and most lasting features of the Industrial Revolution was the rise of cities. In pre-industrial society, over 80% of people lived in rural areas. As migrants moved from the countryside, small towns became large cities. By 1850, for the first time in world history, more people in a country, Great Britain, lived in cities than in rural areas. As other countries in Europe and North America industrialized, they too continued along this path of urbanization. By 1920, a majority of Americans lived in cities. In England, this process of urbanization continued unabated throughout the 19th century. The city of London grew from a population of 2 million in 1840 to 5 million 40 years later. That word unabated means it means not stopped. So this process of urbanization continued nonstop throughout the 19th century, and we saw the growth of population. So, using everything that we've learned from this lesson today, we are going to make a claim for our exit ticket. What do you think urbanization means? Make sure to provide evidence to support your answer. You might use those notes that we took earlier on the graphs to help you with your evidence. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.